Allora, buongiorno a tutte e a tutti, benvenuti e benvenute a quello che è il primo incontro, il primo webinar di un ciclo promosso dall'Associazione Italiana di Comunicazione Politica. Ci occupiamo in questa prima uscita di elezioni presidenziali negli Stati Uniti. Appunto il titolo di questo webinar, US Presidential Election, Biden winning or Trump losing. Ci poniamo quindi una questione che, insomma, dal punto di vista della comunicazione politica è ancora in discussione e su cui abbiamo ancora molto da dire. Allora, we switch in English because, as we know, our seminar is in English. So, first of all, as the president of the Italian Association of Political Communication, I am very proud to start this cycle of online events with such an important topic, and overall with two very prestigious speakers like you are, Ted Devine, Thomas Patterson. So I want to welcome both of you. I suppose that our speakers have a lot of things to say. So in few words, I just want to remember how we go on in this afternoon. First of all, thank you very much also to Paolo Mancini that will introduce our meeting. Then 20 minutes more or less for the presentation by Professor Patterson and that Dr. Devine. Then we can discuss, Paolo Mancini guide us on a discussion with the two presentations. And in the end, we can pick up some questions by the audience that I invite to write your questions, and we pick up them to invite Professor Patterson and Ted Devine to interact with you. So I stop my brief introduction. I pass the word to Paolo Mancini for the introduction, and thank you very much to both of you. Thank you very much to Paolo Mancini to be here with us today.
Good morning to our American friends, and good afternoon to our Italian friends. And let me start this with thanking Christopher Čepernić for organizing this the webinar that can be very interesting, because the topic is interesting, but also our guests are very interesting people. So, Chris, thanks for this organization. My introduction will be very brief, because I have to admit, I have to confess that in this occasion, I did not do any research on U.S. election campaign, U.S. presidential election campaign. I did some research on the previous one, on the Clinton-Trump campaign, but I did not do any serious scientific research in this occasion. So what I'm saying, I say this from an Italian point of view. From a European point of view, in the sense that what I know about the recent U.S. campaign is what the European papers, what the European newspapers have told about the election campaign. The impression that I have, and I want to share this impression with Tom Patterson and Ted Devine, is that my impression is that this was a usual campaign in some way. Was not usual campaign the previous one, the one between Trump and Clinton. It was not usual because the two competitors were in some way outsiders. Trump was a real outsider of politics in U.S., even if he had some political role, but he was not a real politician. And also Clinton was a politician. Hillary Clinton was a politician, but she was a woman. And in a way, being a woman, it meant for her to be some sort of outsider in the way in which the previous election campaigns have been carried out. In this, there were topics that were in some in some way outsider topics. There was the topic of sexism. That is not new in election campaign in US, but in the way in which the importance that sexism and the Trump sexism took the campaign was in some way a new topic. Why the 2020 campaign was not unusual? Because the previous campaign was unusual because Twitter was so important. While in this campaign, Twitter was important, in the Trump-Biden campaign was important, but it was not a novelty. While Twitter and the importance that Twitter played in the Clinton-Trump campaign was very important and was a novelty at that moment. In the last year campaign, Twitter was not a novelty. We were already used to see Twitter and to hear on Twitter, to listen to Twitter and so on. So this is why my impression is that the 2020 campaign, in a way, went back to usual campaign. I don't know if Tom and Ted Devine will share this opinion, but from some sort of European point of view, yes, it was a usual campaign. And actually, it did not get the big importance that the Clinton-Trump campaign instead had on the European press. I read, to prepare this brief introduction, I went back to some research that Tom Patterson carried on the Clinton-Trump campaign, and I found very interesting the idea of meta-narratives that Tom Patterson found in the Clinton-Trump campaign. And I wonder if there are in the 2020 campaign some meta-narratives that Tom Patterson can discuss with us. I can stop here. Let me just introduce the two speakers of today's webinar. Tom Patterson is a Bradley Professor of Government and the Press at the Harvard Kennedy School. Is very well known all over the world. Is a very well known media and political communication scholar. He wrote many books informing the news, the vanishing voter, up to the last one, How American Lost Its Mind. Ted Devine is a political consultant. This makes our seminar even more interesting because we have on one side a scholar point of view, Tom Patterson, and on the other side we can discuss also a professional point of view, the point of view of Ted Devine, who is a political consultant. He was consultant for the Al Gore 2000 campaign, for John Kerry 2004 campaign, and then it was an important media campaign for Bernie Sanders in 2016. Ted Devine is the president of Devine Mulvey Logborg, a Washington-based consultant firm. Each of our speakers will talk for 20 minutes, up to 20 minutes. And the entire seminar will last 1 hour and a half, so we'll stop at 4:30. This is what I want to say, and now the floor to Tom Patterson and then to Ted Devine. At the end of the Tom Patterson presentation, there will be questions from the audience, and I will try to manage a question to each of our speakers. Tom, the floor is yours at this point.
Thank you, Paolo. So I'm going to talk a little bit differently about this election than maybe you expected. I want to use this election as a chance to look forward. But before I start my prepared remarks and show you some slides, I do want to respond to Paolo's question about meta-narratives in this campaign. there were strong meta-narratives in 2016. I think they were a bit more muted this time. One of the meta-narratives that came up very early in the Biden campaign was whether he was showing signs of mental impairment, some sort of mental decline. And that got some traction during the primary season, carried over into the convention period. But by the time you got to the general election, I think the contrast between the candidates, the issues that were on the table, really sort of took over. And, you know, this was really, in Americans' minds, a very important decision about the direction of the country. And I think it was unusual in terms of the amount of attention that was paid to issues. Now, some of that may have been due to the fact that the candidates weren't really on the campaign trail in quite the way that they ordinarily are. So you didn't have all of the hoopla and stuff that normally attends the general election campaign. And if you followed it there, you know that Biden spent much of the general election campaign in his basement and kind of came out the last couple of weeks and made some appearances. So it was a different kind of campaign, and I think unusually substantive. But what I want to talk about is kind of what we might learn from this campaign, kind of looking forward. And I'm sure Tad, you know, is going to provide a lot more insights on what happened in the 2020 campaign than I could. So, but I want to look long term. So bear with me as I try to pull up my my PowerPoint slides. Okay, I want to look into the future a little bit in terms of what we can conclude from the 2020 election about which party might actually become dominant in the US. So this will be familiar to you. We have very deep party polarization in the US. There's an ever-widening divide between Republicans and Democrats. It began surfacing in the 1980s and it's continued ever since. This is just one indicator of it. This is at the level of the public. And when you look at this, you know, in a democratic society, you know, one of the norms is kind of tolerance, that you'll look upon your rivals as opponents or rivals. But Americans increasingly see those in the other party as enemies. That gives you a sense of kind of how deep this divide is between the Republican and the Democratic parties. And here's just an example. What I've done here is to take simply the question on ideology and the median voter in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And as you can see over time, they've moved apart. That's the party polarization that's affecting our politics. It also affects Congress and at the leadership level. So if you go back 30 or 40 years in the US, the red blocks there are Republicans, the blue blocks are Democrats. You can see a lot of overlap in the Congress between Democrats and Republicans. And that really put the power in our lawmaking in the center and not on the edges. But what it looks like today is here. You've got Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other. And it's been very difficult for Republicans and Democrats in Congress to get together on legislation. So that's polarization. Now, there's one other thing, and this gets less attention in the US, is the intensity of the party competition, just how closely competitive our parties are. So these are presidential elections, and I've done this over a 120-year period. And what you can see is that the recent presidential elections have been a lot closer than has been true historically. We have really close presidential elections, elections that could go either way. In much of our earlier history, it was pretty well known in advance of the campaign who was going to be the victor. That's less so today. We see that also in terms of House races. This is a chart, again, looking over roughly the same period of time. And this is the size of the House majority, the party that's in the majority. And again, you can see that the majorities have narrowed. The parties are more evenly matched in terms of competition for House seats. Same is true of the Senate majority. And at the moment, in the Senate of the United States, we've got 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats. And under our constitutional system, if there's a tie vote, then and only then does the vice president, in this case, Kamala Harris, a Democrat, get to cast a vote. Now, here's the importance of this. What's historically been the case in the US is when the parties are really closely matched, they really focus on destroying each other, bashing each other in hopes of winning the next election. I have here a quote from Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell that he made during the first year of Obama's administration, where he said, "The single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president." In other words, Republicans were going to do everything, congressional Republicans were going to do everything they could to block the Democratic agenda. So the lesson of history from the US is we have much better governing, actually, when the parties aren't so closely competitive. When one party is stronger and is pretty confident that it's going to win the next election, then that party is less likely to demonize the other party. And then the weaker party is also less likely to spend its time hammering at the other party because it needs to attract, it needs to pull in some of the voters in the larger party to become competitive. So it actually tends to move a little bit closer to that party and its issue positions. And so the question that I want to kind of address today, is there anything about the 2020 election and other recent elections that would suggest either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party is likely to become the dominant party in US politics? So if we look at Joe Biden's victory, he restored what we call the Democrats' blue wall. Donald Trump threaded the needle in 2016 with the Electoral College by winning in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. If he'd have lost those states, Hillary Clinton would have been the president of the United States. Biden won those states back for the Democrat. They traditionally have gone Democratic. Democrats began to kind of break into the southern tier with victories in Arizona and Georgia. And Biden had a pretty comfortable popular vote margin and also a pretty comfortable electoral vote margin. But it's hard to look at Biden's candidacy and to say this really foretells a long period of Democratic dominance. We have pretty good evidence that Biden was almost the perfect candidate for the Democrats in this year. Kind of set the right tone by talking about trying to bring Americans together, but his background also counted for a lot. Biden is Catholic, and he's a practicing Catholic, and that contributed to a swing in the Catholic vote in his direction, a 9-point swing from what it was in 2016. And then Biden comes from a working class background, an ordinary background, and he played that up in the campaign. And among white working class men who've gone strongly Republican in recent elections, they still went for Trump this year. But Biden was able to pull enough of those voters away. And those voters were really important in the 3 states that I mentioned earlier, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Now, if you look at the Electoral College, this actually was a pretty close call for the Democrats. So they easily won the popular vote. But if you could have moved around even less than 100,000 votes in the states of Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona, and in Nebraska's 2nd district, Donald Trump would have won this election by winning the electoral vote count. And it's generally understood that Biden was the Democrats' strongest possible nominee in 2020. Some of the others that competed for the nomination very likely, I think, would have lost to Trump in this election. So I think there's another reason why Biden's victory might not predict much of anything, and that's Trump's unpopularity. Donald Trump is the first president in the era of systematic polling, and this goes back in the US to the 1930s, to go throughout his presidency without ever once getting to the 50% approval rating with the American public. And there were an unusual number of voters in this campaign, about a fourth, who said their vote was against a candidate as opposed to for a candidate. And those voters went overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. And conceivably, if there had been a different Republican candidate on the ticket, that vote wouldn't have materialized, at least to that degree. Now, there are also some signs of vulnerability on the part of the Democrats. There is a perception, and Republicans are trying to fuel this, that Democrats are too liberal. That seemed to have contributed to Democrats' loss of House seats. They won the presidency, but they did lose some seats in the House. They did a little bit less well among Latinx and Asian American voters, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then there was a late swing to Donald Trump in this election. He did better in picking up late deciders. And this was his message in the closing days of the campaign, that the Democrats are too liberal. And I think going ahead, Democrats' success is going to depend on their ability, in fact and in perception, to convince Americans that they're a moderate option and not a left option. Now let's shift over to the Republican side. So the Republicans were projected to lose House seats in this election, but they cut into the Democratic majority. They did better than expected. And we have a federal system of government. So what happens at the state levels is important as well as what's happening at the national level. And when you look there, Republicans do better than Democrats. About half the states are in Republican control. About a quarter are mixed control, and the Democrats control 15. And looking ahead, and I won't get into this, but it's because of redistricting, gerrymandering, also geography. The landscape favors Republicans. They don't have to have quite as many votes as Democrats do to get a House majority or to get a Senate majority. So the big problem for Republicans is that when you look at demographic change, almost nothing is in their favor. This is one of my favorite charts. This is the percentage of the two-party presidential vote of voters who are under 18 to 29 at the time of the election. And what you can see is over the last 5 presidential elections, these voters have gone very strongly in the Democratic direction. Moreover, as they've aged, they've tended to stay in the Democratic Party and to turn out at a higher rate. This really is an important figure. And they were basically what gave Biden the election, that group. They now include every American between 18 and 44. This is the group that gave Biden his victory in the 2020 election. You can see how well he did among voters 44 and under versus those 45 and over. The Republican Party is an aging party. The younger party is the Democratic Party. And you'd like to be on that side of the demographic curve. I'm going to skip this one because of time. The point I'm going to make here is this is the last time that one of our parties became a really firm majority was a result of the 1930s, the Great Depression, which brought the Democrats into power. But what really allowed them to dominate American politics through the 1960s was that first-time voters, I'm talking about young voters here, went overwhelmingly Democratic, and they stayed Democratic through their lives. And it was that block of voters that election after election allowed Democrats to dominate American politics. And we're seeing the beginnings of that again in our voting pattern. Another thing to look at is the relationship between race, ethnicity, and the vote. what I have here are for Black, Hispanic, and white non-Hispanic voters. Their percentage Democratic in the last 6 presidential elections. And you can see it's been pretty constant with the minority voters voting more Democratic, white voters voting more Republican. But the point is, the growing groups in America, the ones that are increasing as a proportion of the population, are the minority groups. White non-Hispanic Americans are shrinking as a percentage of the population. Again, Republicans on the wrong side of demographic change. This is a really interesting one to me, Asian American voters, and it might be getting into too much detail for what we're talking about here, but when you look at Asian Americans, they have the profile of Republican voters. They have a higher average family income than any other group in America. They're twice as likely as other Americans to own a small business. Those are traditionally Republican voters. But you can see here, this minority bloc has gone Democratic. And they're also a fast-growing demographic bloc. Again, bad news for the Republican Party. I'm going to skip this one in the interest of time. And then there's another advantage, I think, for the Democrats. I don't know how closely you follow our politics, but Democratic Party really made its strong moves to the left in the 1930s with the New Deal, and then in the 1960s with Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. The Democratic Party, according to roll call voting, really hasn't changed all that much since then in its positioning. The real change in our politics has been the shift of the Republican Party to the right. In the 1960s, 1970s, the dominant wing of the Republican Party was the progressive wing, the moderate wing of that party. But beginning with the Reagan presidency in the 1980s, that wing began to shrink. And increasingly, the stronger wing of that party became the conservative wing. And it moved ever further to the right. In the 1990s, under the leadership of Speaker Newt Gingrich, then with the Tea Party movement in 2009, 2010, Donald Trump pushed it further to the right. And what I've shown here, what I show here in this slide, the baseline is the average opinion of independent voters. They're important in the American system. They often hold the balance of power in elections. And I've shown here a number of issues. And the lines are the percentage point difference between the average Democrat and the average Republican from the average independent. And you can see that Republicans are much further from the center in that sense than are the Democrats. And in a two-party system, elections, maybe not in every instance, but over the long term are won in the center. And the Republican Party has pushed itself far enough right that it risks being able to attract in significant number moderate voters. And then here's a final worrying sign for Republican Party. If you've been following what's been happening in the US in the last month or so, with Donald Trump's effort to take back the election that he lost, that has really split Republicans. It's been very divisive generally, but it's also split Republicans, with most Republicans siding with Donald Trump. But there are some Republicans that are very angry about what's happening with their party and where Trump was taking it, and what happened at the Capitol on January 16th with that mob. And this was a poll that was just taken a couple of days ago that asked the question, and this is a Republican respondents only: if Donald Trump started a new party, would you join it? And when you look at that, about 2/3 of Republicans are entertaining the possibility that they would leave their party if Donald Trump started a new party. This break in the Republican Party, this split around Trump, the pro and anti-Trump factions, what we sometimes call the Trump Republicans and the governing Republicans or establishment Republicans is increasingly deep and could hamper the party's ability to win elections going forward. Now, if the signs generally favor the Democrats, well, what could go wrong for them? Well, in a two-party system, or at least in the American two-party system, it's really bad to be the party in power if the economy is faltering and doesn't look like it's going to recover fast enough. And we're not sure what's going to happen. We have deep economic structural problems from COVID-19 in this country. And many think it will be 2024 before we really begin to recover substantially from what's happened from the pandemic. Now, historically, that's bad for the party in power. And right now, the Democrats are the party in power. There could be slippage, too, in Democratic support among Hispanics and Asian Americans. Many of their opinions look more closely like Republican opinions than Democratic opinions. And it's going to be a question of whether Democrats can hold on to these important growing minority groups. And then another thing that could possibly go wrong for the Democrats is it could lose its positioning advantage. I made the point that the Democrats are closer to the center than are the Republicans. But there are some Democrats that are pushing the party to try to move it to the left. And it's going to be interesting to watch that fight. But it's going to be a fight in two ways. One, there's going to be a reality to it. Are they in fact moving? But there's also being a question of the public's perception of what the Democrats represent. And it's the perception, of course, that matters for voters. And if they get the perception that the Democrats are moving as strongly to the left as the Republicans have to the right, then that positioning advantage the Democrats have now could be wasted. So let me stop there. Thank you so much. I'll pass it along to Tad.
Great. Thank you, Tom. First of all, let me say I very much agree with what Professor Patterson said about the closeness to the election, how it could have easily gone the other way, and also about the prospects for the future, I think, particularly for my party. What I want to focus on today, though, is what happened in the election. How and why did Joe Biden win the election? I think there are many reasons for that, and I want to focus on a few that I think are the most important. First, there was a large cohort of voters who decided that they could not abide Donald Trump and importantly, found Joe Biden as an acceptable alternative. Now, that's an opinion, but I think that opinion can be quantified if we look at the numbers, numbers that we typically associate with. I'll turn my volume down a little bit. Whoops, that's mine. Just want to turn the volume down. You don't have as much feedback. Numbers that we typically associated with measuring how voters feel about candidates, particularly incumbent candidates in re-election. The two that we look at in campaigns that I think we focus on most are the favorability and unfavorability of the candidate, how people feel about them personally, and also, in the case of an incumbent, whether or not the voters approve of their job performance. And when you look at those numbers, I think it tells a very interesting story, and I think it gives probably as much or the most insight as to why this election turned out the way it did. First, favorability. Joe Biden had a positive profile when it came to his favorability. According to the exit poll, I think the exit poll is sort of the best place to look. Where were the voters on the day they actually voted? The exit poll wasn't just a one-day exercise this time. We had a lot of people who voted tens of millions before election day itself. So the exit polling was done through a series of pre-election polls and then on election day itself. Biden's favorability in the exit poll was 52%. His unfavorability was 46%. Maybe not a great profile in general, but net positive, +6. Compare that to Hillary Clinton 4 years before. Her favorability in the exit poll was 43%. Her unfavorability was 55%. So you had a very different situation with Biden. Most people, the majority of the electorate, were favorable towards him. How about Trump? Well, on election day in 2020, Trump's favorability was 46, his unfavorability was 52. So a net negative, favorable, unfavorable, personally. But what's remarkable, and I think the reason you have to look beneath the surface of these numbers, if you look back just 4 years before on election day in the exit poll, Trump's favorability in 2016 was 38%. His unfavorability was 60%. He was negative 22 when he won election for president. He was only negative 6 when he lost it. So what does that tell you? Well, I think if you look beneath the surface, you realize why the favorability mattered so much more, I think, in 2016 in some ways, and again in 2020. First of all, in 2016, voters had something in the United States they didn't have in 2020. They had some real options. Okay, there were credible third-party candidates, particularly the libertarian candidates, who achieved ballot access in every state. Okay, they were Gary Johnson and Bill Weld, two former Republican governors, serious people. They theoretically could have won 538 electoral votes, okay, because they were on the ballot everywhere. That didn't happen so much. There was ballot access, but not for people who got visibility. The guy who had the most visibility probably was Kanye West, okay, the entertainer, and the Republicans are trying to get him on, but he couldn't seem to get on a lot of ballots, so there wasn't that third option to go with. Secondly, and if you look at all the polling, you see the voters thought 2020 there was so much at stake. Tom Patterson mentioned this. There was really, they just were not going to waste that vote. The vote for president of the United States is the only vote that our voters have for a federal office. Okay, we don't vote for cabinet members, in the executive branch. We vote for the Congress, but we don't vote for anybody else in the executive branch, just the president. And I found, in working on a lot of presidential campaigns, it's a vote that they really consider and they don't want to waste. They won't give away. And we see this particularly in New Hampshire in the primaries, in the early primaries, Iowa. If you're not relevant, if you're not salient, you're not going to get a vote from these people. They're not going to waste the vote. And that's true in the general election as well. So if you look in 2016 at those favorable and unfavorable voters, Hillary Clinton, and then you look at those 2020 favorable, unfavorable voters for Biden, Trump, you'll see a difference. In 2016, 77% of the voters who had an unfavorable view of Donald Trump voted for Hillary Clinton. Now, that's a lot of people. But in 4 years later, in 2020, 93% of the voters who had an unfavorable view of Donald Trump voted for Joe Biden. Okay, now that's that's a lot of people when you add it up, and it's responsible for a pretty good chunk of the electorate. And again, the position of those third-party candidates in some places like Michigan, in Wisconsin, where the third-party candidates got 6% of the vote in 2016. Places like Pennsylvania, where the third-party candidates got 4% of the vote in 2016. Those alternatives to people who were unfavorable personally towards Donald Trump provided a path for his victory with a lot less than 50% of the vote. And, I think we saw that pretty vividly in that election. Now, the second measure that we usually talk about beyond personal favorability is job approval. President of the United States, it's a question that's been asked for a long time. Do you approve, Tom Patterson referenced it, do you approve or disapprove of the job that the president's doing? The Gallup poll has been asking this question the same way for a very long time. And this is the first president, I think, in history of recorded polling who never got to 50% in job approval. Donald Trump never got to 50. He got close. He was at 49 a number of times. He was at 49% job approval as late as May 1st through 13th of 2020. Interestingly, by the way, his lowest job approval as president was in January of 2021. They did a poll from the 4th to the 15th of January, and his job approval was down to 34%. But in 2020, he was at 49% sometimes. And what is most remarkable to me, and I guess because I'm a partisan Democrat, I worked for helped the Biden campaign and produce advertising for the Democratic National Committee. And what is most shocking to me is that if you look at the exit poll, and again, we're talking about data, not opinion here, and you look at what the exit poll said about the president's job approval on election day, the day the voters voted. How did they feel about the job Donald Trump was doing as president? Well, His job approval was 50% in the exit poll. 50 was 49% disapproval. There was polarization, but nevertheless, Trump actually got to 50 with his job approval. Now, I think that says a lot about the effort of the Trump campaign to change the composition of the electorate to their favor. They got a lot of vote out. They got a lot of people out there supporting him. But again, just like with the favorable, unfavorable split, I think you need to look beneath the surface of that job approval and to see what happened with voters. 8% of the voters who approved of the job that Donald Trump was doing voted for Joe Biden. 91% voted for Trump. 96% of those who disapproved of the way Trump handled the job as president voted for Biden. Okay, remember 4 years before? Hillary got 77% of the unfavorable. Okay, this time Biden got 96% of the disapproval. So I think there was that coalescing of people. And listen, this process began well before Election Day. There was a women's march in the United States the weekend after the election. It was probably the biggest social movement of people assembled together in American history. Okay, so this thing had been building for a long time. And again, I think you got to give Trump and his people some credit for identifying and finding an electorate and mobilizing those voters, in such an enormous way. Turnout was amazing in the United States in 2020, historic. 2/3 of the people basically eligible to vote actually got out and voted, and that is very important. But what's most important in our system, and Biden obviously achieved a substantial popular vote victory, is not the turnout overall, but the turnout in particular. Okay, where do people turn out in places that decide elections? And what we saw in this election was an enormous amount of turnout. And as Professor Patterson mentioned before, the turnout in these battleground states, the places that decide the election, resulted in a lot of close contests. We saw this in 2016. In 2016, in what we used to call the blue wall up until 2016, in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, states that Democrats had won going back decades. Mike Dukakis, who I worked for in 1988, won Wisconsin. Okay, we won a lot. John Kerry, Al Gore, we won Pennsylvania, we won Michigan, we won Wisconsin. But Donald Trump managed to win those states by a narrow margin in 2016. He won Michigan by 0.2% of the vote. That was a little more than 10,000 votes. He won Pennsylvania by 0.7% of the vote. That's 56,000 votes. He won Wisconsin by 0.8% of the vote, 22,000 votes. Okay, so those three states in 2016 decided the outcome. It was a total of those three states of 76,646 votes. You combine them together. Not a lot of votes in a huge national electorate, not a lot of margin in those individual states, each one less than a point. Let's fast forward to 2020. Again, the outcome changes in three places. In this case, Arizona, which Biden won by 0.3%, 10,457 votes. Georgia, which Biden won by 0.24%. 11,779 votes. Wisconsin, which Biden won by 0.6%, 20,608 votes. Okay, those three states combined are 37 electoral votes. Subtract 37 electoral votes from Joe Biden margin, and Donald Trump is now the president of the United States. Okay, so it was so close. We thought in 2016, 76,000 votes. It was only 42,000 votes in 2020. Much closer. And, I think, again, what are the reasons for that? Did Trump lose it? Did Biden win it? Well, I would say a little of both happened. Biden did a good job. He got 51.3% of the popular vote in the nation. That's a higher percentage of popular vote against an incumbent president than any candidate since Franklin Roosevelt won in 1932. Okay, that's an impressive thing. The Democrats, as Professor Patterson pointed out, seem to have a lot of advantages on the playing field. One of the advantages is that my party, has won the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections, okay, including with Al Gore, who I worked for, and Hillary Clinton won as well. I don't think that's happened since the beginning of political parties in the 1820s in this country. It's 7 out of 8. I mean, that's an enormous streak. And I think, Biden got a lot of votes in the right places because he ran a good campaign, a very good campaign. It was focused. They dealt with, in campaigns, things happen. And you've got to be ready to deal with the course of events. He did so very well. When COVID happened, there was a lot of criticism from some quarters. He's not out there enough. He's not campaigning. It turned one of his chief strategists. His name is Mike Donlin. Very close. We grew up together. His brother Tom, who was President Obama's national security advisor, is my best friend. We all grew up in the same neighborhood in Providence, Rhode Island. Mike and I used to be business partners, and I happened to see him because I live on an island in Rhode Island, and the ferry comes into the mainland, and Mike happens to have a house near the ferry, and so I saw him in May, and we were talking about the campaign and how it was unfolding, and at a safe social distance with masks on outside, but and he said to me, "Boy, yeah, they're all trying to get Biden to go out," and I keep telling him, "Why would we go out there? What are you kidding?" And I said, "That's exactly how I feel. That would be the worst mistake you could possibly make. Burn the guy out. He's the oldest candidate ever run. Lose control of what you're doing." And so I think they made good decisions, smart decisions. They were criticized in some quarters. Another smart thing that they did, and this is again different from what the Clinton campaign did. Clinton and Biden both had resource superiority. Okay, and resource superiority usually translates into victory in politics at almost any level. Biden raised a little more than $1 billion for his campaign, and his allies raised a little less than $600 million total. Both allies and Biden, $1.6 billion. Trump, who by the way started raising money the day after he was sworn in as president, and that's when he filed for a campaign and began raising money for it. He raised less than that, $778 million he spent. His allies raised $302 million. So he had about $1 billion. So $1.6 billion for Biden, $1 billion for Trump. But what I think the Biden campaign did that was especially important is they spent it well. Okay, they spent it in Michigan. They spent it in Pennsylvania. They spent it in Wisconsin. They didn't spend it in Texas when there was tremendous pressure to go into a state that has 29 mini markets. Okay, the whole thing could get spent in Texas. They didn't do that. They waited and they saw that Arizona had possibilities and opportunities, that Georgia had possibilities and opportunities. And they, in the end, used that financial advantage to exploit and open up and in the end win in those places. And in places like Nebraska in the 2nd Congressional District, which allocates electors based on the victory in a particular congressional district. I think those resource allocation decisions made a big difference in the outcome in a close election. And they do stand in contrast to what the Clinton campaign did by not sending Hillary to Wisconsin, by not running TV ads till 10 days out in Michigan, and other mistakes that they made. Finally, let me say before I run out of time that I think there is a new modern Democratic coalition that is emerging now in American politics. Although, listen, this coalition could have lost everything last time and almost did in some cases, almost lost the House, barely claimed the Senate, and took the presidency by a more narrow margin than Trump did 4 years earlier. This Democratic coalition is centered in urban America. Of the 50 largest counties in the United States, the only single county that Joe Biden lost was Suffolk County, which is out in Long Island in New York. He lost it by about 250 votes out of 750,000 cast in that county. Okay, he won over 90 of the top 100 counties in terms of population in America. The Brookings Institution did a study right after the election, said that the counties that Biden won produce 70% of the economic output of the United States. Okay, so this is a coalition, as Professor Patterson mentioned, and I think this is incredibly important. A younger coalition. People tend to stick with their vote once they start making it. When they're young people. But Biden's victory was not just centered in these large, diverse urban centers. It expanded into the suburbs, the big suburbs of big cities, places like the communities that surround Denver, Colorado. Biden tripled Hillary Clinton's winning margin in those Denver suburbs. In Pennsylvania, Biden beat Trump by 275,000 votes in the 4 big suburban counties that surround Philadelphia. That's 50% more of a margin than Hillary Clinton achieved in those counties in 2016. In Georgia, he not only won the Atlanta area big, but he won the 2 large suburban counties, Cobb and Gwinnett, by 100,000 more votes than Hillary Clinton did. And we saw this in Wisconsin, and we saw this in Michigan as well. So there is, I think, an emerging Democratic coalition. It is young, it is diverse, it is open to, and diverse within its new ideas. It believes that climate change is caused by man, and and that we have to deal with it as an urgent threat. These are all, I think, good signs for the Democratic Party. However, it's still very close, and it still could, I think, change, because the Republicans do have a real advantage in an electoral system that is set up to give all the electoral votes from certain places where they have gigantic advantage. And one final gigantic advantage is they win white voters. Now, the final change I think you have to look at in that regard is the composition of the electorate when it comes to white voters. A few years ago, 2012, I was asked by my alma mater, Brown University, to go down to Florida and speak to groups of alumni. These tend to be people who give a lot of money to the university. They want to supply someone to speak to them. So I went down and I tried to give a very nonpartisan speech. I didn't want to be I'm not very partisan in my work, but I wanted to be straightforward. But as I was going through why Obama won, I showed a slide. And the slide was this: the composition of the electorate. In 1984, when Walter Mondale, who I work for, lost decisively 49 states to Ronald Reagan, and I took the same percentages of the electorate and ascribed to Mondale the percentages that President Obama won. So the percentage of white voters he won, the percentage of black voters he won, the percentage of Latino voters he won. And if you do that exercise in 1984, when the electorate was 89% white, okay, you will see that Walter Mondale's numbers, okay, in the Obama electorate would have led to Walter Mondale's victory, okay, in the popular vote in America today. Now, that electorate is so much less white than it was then, 89% in 1984. In 2016, 71% of the electorate, white voters. In 2020, 67% of the electorate was white voters, okay? That's what's happening. America is changing. It's becoming more diverse. The Republicans don't seem to have appeal to many quarters of that. They found some places where they did better, like South Florida and South Texas this time, with Latino voters, with African-American males, marginally better than before. But are they going to be able to sustain even that little growth? I doubt it, because of their policies and practices. So, what I see in this election is that Joe Biden won because people really didn't like Trump, thought Joe Biden was okay, felt comfortable with him, were willing to make the move towards him, did so in enough numbers in enough places to result in a small and nevertheless decisive victory for the Democrats. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks to both of you, very interesting. And while we wait for questions from our audience, let me try to give a summary of what you said. Using Tom Patterson words, he said he began his talk saying, looking forward. The impression I have from the two presentations is that we are looking forward a Democrat United States. And I wonder if this is a right impression that I took from the two presentations, from Tom Patterson data, and also from what Ted Devine said about the young Democrats, the young Americans looking Democrat rather than Republican. So are we looking forward an America more and more Democrat rather than Republican? This is the first question I can put on the table. The second idea I had from the two presentations is that Biden, as Ted Devine said, was a right choice, and that there were previous conditions before the campaign that determined the Democrat victory, the victory of Biden. So there were conditions before the campaign that caused the victory of Biden. Ted Devine said that Biden ran a good campaign. It seems to me that the campaign mattered, but not so much. I had this impression from what you say that the conditions were such that Trump could not win, and that Biden did not make any big mistake to lose and to disappoint the conditions that were very favorable to Biden rather than to Trump. Am I right in my summary of your presentation? So I am asking this both to Thomas and to the Tad.
So I can take your first crack. No, I think you summarized pretty well, Paolo, what we were arguing. Now, the thing that I would emphasize, the future looks pretty good for the Democrats, but Republicans have some kind of built-in advantages that Democrats are kind of working against that don't have a lot to do with kind of preferences across the whole electorate. And Tad mentioned how many of the recent presidential elections the Democrats have won the popular vote, and yet they've lost two of the ones where they had more popular votes. That was the 2000 Bush victory and the 2016 Trump victory. And as both of us mentioned, this was a lot closer than it looked. If you concentrate on the electoral college vote, you don't have to move that many votes for Trump to be back in for a second term. That's an advantage that Republicans have simply because of the way our system is designed and where basically they're concentrated versus where Democrats are concentrated. Tad made the point about how strong Democrats are in urban areas and increasingly in suburban areas. But when you come, for example, to House elections, that means you're also going to waste a lot of votes. Your candidates are going to be in overwhelmingly Democratic districts, right? So, you look at the New York metropolitan area and, Democrats there tend to win overwhelmingly, which means they don't need a lot of those votes to win. And then you get into the sparser, more rural areas of upstate New York, and you find pockets of Republicanism, but Republicans. And then you go out into the Midwest, the sparsely populated Midwest. Well, every state in our system elects 2 senators. And when you look at kind of where the Republicans are picking up most of their Senate seats, it's in these smaller states. So they have an advantage in terms of just the way their voters are distributed relative to where the Democratic voters are distributed. Then on the other point, one of the things as to whether this was decided by what went on in the campaign versus kind of just the way conditions, policies, what had happened to the 4 years of Trump. I think anytime you're looking at a campaign this close, the things that Tad was talking about matter. This could have gone either way. And I think he's quite right. I think Biden ran a much sharper campaign, both in terms of messaging and also in terms of resource allocation than Trump did. And given the states that were so close that could have swung it back in Trump's direction, I do think that was maybe a decisive factor in the outcome. But you're also right in suggesting that kind of deeper forces were at work here. So one of the things that's a result of our polarization, this fact that Americans are so widely divided, Republicans and Democrats very distant, we have fewer votes in the middle. It's harder for either party to kind of really pull votes in. And if you look at the polls as an indicator of that, for example, let's go back to even the Mondale campaign of '84, which was a one-sided Reagan victory, or if you go back even more to the 1976 Jimmy Carter race. What you see from kind of the summer months to November, you see a lot of movement of the electorate, and the polls can kind of go up and down, and you get really large changes in support for one candidate or the other. You look at the 2016 campaign and the Trump-Clinton campaign. There's about a 7-point difference at max between the two candidates anytime in the polls during that full period. The Biden-Trump campaign this time, the gap in the polls wasn't large at any point and didn't move all that much. So, yeah, I think that reflects those deeper things that were involved here. Tad talked about many of them. A lot had to do with what Trump thought of the Trump presidency, or what voters thought of the Trump presidency. And in many people's minds, that made up their mind as to whether they were going to side with him or against him. But then again, because our parties are so closely competitive, what the campaigns do moves votes on the margins. And boy, you look at this campaign and you think, Trump could have won this darn thing, even though he kind of got swamped in the popular vote, and he won it for some of the reasons that Tad was talking about, just how smart they were in their issue positioning and in how they allocated their resources.
Thanks,
yes,
Tom. Let me say something before going to Tad. I found very interesting your slide on lessons of history. I found very interesting because I think that it can be applied also to the Italian situation. If we have time, we can go back to that slide. But then after Ted, and then we have two questions. Ted, you want to say something now?
No, well, I was just going to say that I agree that the outcome of the election was not inevitable in terms of Trump winning. I do also agree with you, Professor Mancini, that there is no way that Trump could have won the popular vote in the United States. Okay, that was not within his reach. That wasn't going to happen under any circumstance. And indeed, the scope of Biden's popular vote victory, I think, is a proof and demonstration of that. But our system allows candidates to win elections by making enormous, extraordinary efforts in certain places. And those places look very different. You know, the white Midwest of the United States, places like Iowa, you know, they look very different than the diverse, you know, collection of voters in states and other places of the country. So, you know, this, you know, the Democratic Party does have a lot of good things. In terms of your first point, the Democratic Party, I think, has a lot of possibilities for the future. Having said that, those possibilities can change very quickly. The way that our system works in the United States, the flow of information, which is numbing, okay, constantly. And also something that we haven't talked about, which I think is maybe one of the most important factors in our politics. The way money funds campaigns in the United States absolutely distorts everything. It pushes, I think, the candidates very much towards either end of the ideological spectrum. Okay, because the unlimited money that comes in from outside of the process puts enormous pressure on candidates to be in certain places on certain issues, and you know, and that is having an incredibly corrosive effect, I think, on the politics of the United States.
Okay, thanks, Ted. I understand that we have two questions. One from Celeste Satta. I read the question. Tulsa showed how Jens is able to organize and mobilize on political matters. How do you think these new methods of organizing and the characteristics of this platform affect the campaign? And do you think it will change the campaign for young people in the future? I guess this is a question for both of you. If you want to answer rapidly, please, Tom, please, Ted.
So I'm going to actually defer to Tad on this one, but let me just say one thing. I do think these various ways of being able to mobilize and activate voters are important, social media and the like. So I do think these things can help. My general opinion on this, though, is that for all voters, younger and older alike. It's kind of the mood of the moment, the issues of the moment that really are the big drivers of turnout. We saw a huge turnout in this election. We haven't seen a turnout at this level for about 100 years or so. And what was driving that? Well, it wasn't social media. It was the Trump presidency and how people were reacting to the Trump presidency that was the big driver here. But I'll let Tad get into the details of the question.
Well, I think social media is changing certainly the way people like me communicate with voters, and it's particularly given us opportunities to talk to young people who in the past have not participated in as high number as older voters. Now with this opportunity to communicate with them, we as the Democratic Party, I think, has an enormous advantage, as Professor Patterson demonstrated in some of the slides he showed. The advantage of younger people's moving towards Democrats can be decisive and can change the entire political geography. So, for example, in 2008, when Barack Obama ran and hit a high watermark in terms of support of young people, we saw something that we haven't seen ever before. In some places, North Carolina, Indiana, two states that Democrats hadn't won in generations in the presidential, but Obama won. He was able to win, I think, for two reasons. Number one, in both of those places, he actually mobilized enough young people to achieve as many 18 to 29-year-olds in the electorate as 65 plus voters. Usually we get these elections where there'll be 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, the number of older people in the oldest cohort to the youngest cohort. When Obama achieved parity between 18 to 29-year-olds and 65 plus and won only that age cohort in 2008 in North Carolina and Indiana, he won the statewide vote and the electoral votes in both of those states. So these social media platforms now are allowing us to engage in direct communication. And when you do that, and now you can sort of figure out what to say to people because there's so much information available on all of us, unfortunately, right now that's available, you can hopefully mobilize, energize, turn out the vote, and change the composition of the electorate. The other thing Obama did in North Carolina in 2008 was he won with 35% of the white vote. Okay, I had worked for John Edwards, who was a senator before he ran for vice president from North Carolina in 1998, and we were fixated on the white vote. We needed 41% to win. We got 41%. He got 51% of the vote. He was elected senator. Obama won with 35%. So changing the composition of the electorate through these tools of social media by communicating right messages to target voters, particularly young people, but also others, but particularly young people, and getting them to make up a bigger percentage of the electorate is the key to success, in my view, for the Democrats in the future. And these platforms are so important to achieving that result.
Thank you. Now the other questions. Alice Fubini, one slide showed by Professor Patterson highlighted how deeply the Republican Party is divided. How will the delay in taking position with or against Trump after the election affect the future of the Republican Party on one hand and the party relationship with the electorate on the other? This is a question to you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Paolo. Yeah, that's an important question. I think an interesting one. I think there's some real work that the Republican Party has to do in terms of just thinking about what it is. So after the 2012 presidential election, in which Obama beat Romney, it had been 1988 since the Republicans had won the popular vote in the presidential election. And the Republican National Committee did what they called an autopsy about what the party needed to do going forward to be competitive. And it was to reach out to women voters, to reach out to Hispanics, minorities generally, that it had to reposition itself. Now, that didn't fly with the party base. So, for example, shortly thereafter, there was an attempt at comprehensive immigration reform, and immigration is a large issue with Asian Americans and with Hispanics, and these are areas where the Republicans struggle to get support. And yet, when that came up shortly after that report, it was killed in the Congress of the United States by Republicans. And I think that speaks to the strength in the party of its right wing as opposed to the moderate faction in that party. And one of the things that's happened over time is that the party has been shedding its moderates. And one of the things that we have that you don't have in your system are primaries. So to get the nomination as a candidate, you run in a primary. The party doesn't bestow it on you. And where this intersects with what's happening in the US right now in our politics is that increasingly our districts are one-sided, heavily Democratic or heavily Republican as a result of kind of this geographical distribution that Tad was alluding to. And in many of our states, and even more so in our House races, the really important race is the primary election, not the general election, right? That the district or state is so one-sided in favor of one party or the other that if you win the primary of the stronger party, you're almost certain to be elected. Well, what's happening on the Republican side is that right-wing group faction tends to be stronger in primaries than the moderate faction, which means increasingly the candidates who are winning those elections are of that kind. And then you try to think about, okay, so the muscle in the Republican Party is increasingly to the right. The way the structures operate kind of are increasingly pushing in that direction. We haven't talked at all here about partisan talk shows, and there's a real muscle on the right-wing media, and boy, they demand loyalty to the far right among Republican candidates. This is a party that strikes me is kind of stuck in a position that's not a very strong position, but doesn't have enough moderates and enough muscle there to move it off where it is. And my own feeling is that we're not going to get much change on the part of the Republican Party until, and if the Democratic Party, as both of Tad and I are suggesting, really is kind of much better positioned for the future. The way American parties have kind of reformed themselves is when they begin to lose elections kind of one after another, right? And if they come close, they think they're doing well enough to win the next time. It's when they start to get hammered 2, 3, 4 times in a row, that's when they kind of wake up, look in the mirror and say, we got to make some adjustments. So that would be my prediction about the future of the Republican Party. I don't see much prospect of change right now. I see an increasingly divided party, but the stronger wing is the reactionary wing of that party, and is going to drive it into the ground for a while, and then at some point it's going to have to kind of swing around to be competitive.
Thanks, Alicia, for your question. Thanks, Tom, for your answer. Luigi Di Gregorio, do you think that the main problem for the Republican Party will be how to manage the Trump legacy from now on, and that for Democrats, identify politics preventing the emergence of leftist common narrative? I refer to Mark Lilla or Jonathan Haidt's position on this topic. Questions for both of you. We have still 20 minutes, so we have to be brief in questions and in answer. Ted, you want to start?
Sure. I believe managing Trump, just the Trump legacy, Trump himself, is the central problem of the Republican Party. And by the way, of the United States of America right now. Okay, that's what that impeachment proceeding that's occurring right now in the Capitol, I think, is vividly demonstrating to the public. What Trump is going to do, how he's going to do it, this is the centerpiece. And the Republican Party, I believe, is not going to be able to recover and become a mainstream political party again, as long as Donald Trump is its figurehead leader. And by the way, he hasn't just been a national leader. The Trump forces have taken over the Republican Party at the local level in many places. That's why the Arizona Party is attacking John McCain's widow, okay, and their Republican governor. That's why the Louisiana Party yesterday criticized their incumbent senator because he voted, saying that it was constitutional for the Senate to hear the impeachment proceedings. Okay, the Trump forces are on the ground and they are active and they are, throwing their weight around against the, incumbent Republican Party until they fix that or do something about it and can unite. One of the reasons Biden won, I didn't talk about this, is he was able to unite the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders, who I worked for in 2016, he had a much better relationship with Joe Biden, and Joe Biden welcomed him into the ranks, and they were strong allies throughout the course of the campaign, and I think they continue to be today. So, as for the Democrats and identity politics, I do think that's something that the Democratic Party is going to have to deal with. And the way to deal with it, I believe, is to construct a common agenda which speaks to core economic issues like wages, health insurance, issues of that nature, and to lead that agenda into law so that it supports working people in the United States of America. If the Democrats can come to that point and achieve that, I think they'll have a chance of becoming a majority party in the United States.
Tom, do you want to add something? Okay, thanks. I wonder if we can see more questions all together so that we can manage our time. Anyway, Marco Cacciotto, was Kamala a little more important than the usually relevant pick of a vice president? They were campaigning a lot together. Interesting question, I guess. Tom, first to you. Kamala.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'll take the scholarly retreat here, and we don't have the data yet. So defending myself in that way, let me speculate a little bit. I'm not sure she helped all that much, to be honest with you. I thought that you would think, for instance, that if you put on the ticket a woman who was also a Black American, also South Asian, that this might strengthen your support among the Asian American voters and among the Black voters. But with both of those groups, at least according to the exit polls, and they're not perfect polls, by the way. There's some problems with the exit polls, but they are kind of our best first shot at what was going on. Democrats did a little bit less well with those groups than they did last time. So I'm trying to puzzle why that would have been the case. Now, it may be that she was vital in terms of turnout in certain places. So it may be kind of in terms of where the impact was. And I'm sure Tad has better insights into that than I do. But when you look at it from a kind of a macro level, it's a little bit hard to tell kind of whether she had any impact at all, and certainly whether it was a measurable positive one.
Well, I would say that in 1988, I had the privilege of being the campaign manager for Lloyd Bentsen when he ran for vice president of the United States. And I can't think of a vice presidential mismatch more than Quayle and Bentsen in 1988. I mean, Bentsen was just incredible in that debate. He was so well, and he had almost no impact whatsoever on the outcome of the election, okay? And I think, unfortunately, that's the way it is with vice presidents. They're not really going to, I think, impact voters. I think Harris was very helpful politically to Biden, picking an African-American woman, picking someone, who was so attracted to so many core constituent groups within the Democratic Party, I think helped him in putting that Democratic Party solidly together behind him. But with voters, no, I don't think there's a lot of impact for any vice president. I've never seen it.
May I speculate that her importance will improve a lot in the future rather than now. I mean, because she is becoming a figure. She became after the campaign, not before the campaign, and very likely this will affect American citizens rather than voters. Okay, next questions. If we have other, I think that we have 3 other questions. Christopher Chepernich, Chris, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I would like to ask both the speakers what importance the postal vote really had on the final result. Oh, this is very questionable question, I guess. Tom, will you start? The postal vote.
No, in the interest of time, let me defer to Tad on that. I don't have hard data on that.
The fact that America could vote by mail in large numbers this time, and as well as vote early in voting locations across country, I think had a real important impact on the vote. It's one of the reasons, I think, again, we don't have all the proof of this, but it seems very logical that we had the highest turnout, since the early 20th century, okay, in terms of percentage of the electorate that turned out. It's also something I think that benefited Democrats. And my proof for that is the Republicans are furiously trying to shut it down right now. In state legislature after state legislature where they control things, they want to stop this early voting. They want to stop voting by mail. They are alleging fraud, which never existed. And there was no evidence of it whatsoever. That's why Trump lost every court case that he filed along those lines. And so I do think it's important. And I think this is a big fight for Democrats. We have to stand up and say, listen, we support participatory democracy in America, and we need to take down hurdles to participation. And so I think it was an important factor in the overall turnout. And certainly in some of these places, which were decided by very narrow margins, I think it could have been an important factor there as well.
Thanks. Next question. Gianpietro Mazzoleni, in case Trump establishes his own party, there will be 3 parties. What do you think might happen to the 2-party system in the US? Tom, you want to say something?
Sure. So, if you look at the history of our system, it kind of really only tolerates 2 parties on an ongoing basis. Now, it doesn't mean that periodically you don't have a strong third party pop up. We had that happen in the 1912 election when Theodore Roosevelt, after not getting the Republican nomination, started a third party. And probably if you're looking for a politician in terms of who had a following in the way that Donald Trump did after his presidency, Teddy Roosevelt is probably the closest example. George Wallace in 1968. But we have a lot of features of our system that basically reward the 2 bigger parties. I think it's possible if Trump wants to do it and he were to set up another party, I think we would briefly have kind of a 3-party system. But I think what would happen is that would then evolve into a 2-party system, probably one being kind of the one that Trump started, with kind of other Republicans who were not part of that having to make a choice between the Democrats or the Republicans. I think it would be disastrous for the Republican Party if that were to happen. But I just don't foresee that we would have an extended period of 3-party competition. What's happened in that case when you've had a party divided in this country, the smaller party actually tends to sometimes have a chance. Woodrow Wilson got to be president in 2012 for that reason, and Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States in 1860 for that reason. These were both candidates from parties that were the smaller of the 2 parties, but a break in the larger party disrupted that. So I just see that this is a 2-party system, and that's the long-term tendency. It doesn't mean we couldn't have an election or 2 where we wouldn't have 3 significant parties going at it.
Ted, what is your opinion in this regard?
I agree with that. I think if Trump does start a party, and frankly, I'm as a partisan Democrat, I'm rooting for the Trump party to come on board and to particularly all across the South and all the places where it's so hard to Democrats. But if you look at a more recent example, 1992, when Ross Perot ran for president, established himself as a credible candidate, won almost 20% of the vote. Bill Clinton was able to win a decisive victory of 43% of the popular vote. And I think that's what Trump would do. He would turn the Republican Party into the party that crushed George Bush in 1992. And hopefully he could do that not only at the presidential level, but in congressional races as well.
Okay, I wonder if we have other questions. I didn't count so far. Do we have? No. I think we don't have other question. No more. Yes. Okay. Very interesting. Let me thank both our presenters, Tom Patterson and Ted Devine. And let me thank also the organizers, Christopher Chepernich, the president of the Italian Political Communication Association, and Antonio Martella, who ran all this very efficiently. Thanks to all, and next seminar. Ciao.
Thank you.
Chris.
Grazie anche a chi ci ha ascoltati da casa, che ci ha seguiti, grazie per le domande. Thank you very much to everybody.